Welcome to the third video in our four-part series, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. In this video, Morgan tells some stories about the risks we face as investors. And it may not be exactly what you expect, because sometimes the risks are the things we do not see.
The third story is that risk is what you don't see. And this too is a story with nothing to do with investing. I want to tell you a story about this guy right here, Harry Houdini, one of the most famous magicians to ever live, who did most of his work in the United States about 100 years ago. And Houdini, of course, was known for his escapes. He would tie himself up in chains or in a straitjacket, and he'd throw himself in a river or bury himself in sand, whatever he would do, and he would escape. He'd find his way out. He was the best in the world at this. This is what he became famous for. But Houdini had another trick that he played during his shows. And audiences loved it. He wasn't famous for it, but they loved it. And what he would do is at the end of every show, he would invite the largest, strongest man onto stage from the audience. And he would tell that man to punch him in the stomach as hard as he could. So Houdini would stand there with his hands up and the guy would punch on him as hard as he could. And Houdini wouldn't flinch. His claim to fame was that he could flex his stomach in a way that would absorb anyone's punches. So audiences loved it. They had a different sense of humor than maybe we do today, but this was a big hit at the time. And now one day after a show in 1922, Harry Houdini went back to his dressing room and he invited a group of college students back there to meet him. One of the college students was a guy named Robert Whitehead. And Robert Whitehead walked up to Harry Houdini and he started punching him in the stomach as hard as he could. He didn't mean any harm. He wasn't trying to pick a fight. He just thought he was doing the trick that he had just seen on stage. Now, Houdini was not prepared to be punched. He didn't see this coming. He fell to the ground in pain. He said, "What are you doing?" Robert Whitehead said, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Houdini. I thought I was just doing the trick." Houdini said, "I'm not prepared. I wasn't flexing my stomach, and now I'm in a lot of pain." Harry Houdini went to bed that night, doubled over in pain. He woke up the next morning. He couldn't even get out of bed. He was in so much pain. His appendix had ruptured the night before, almost certainly from Robert Whitehead's punches. And Harry Houdini died later that day. This is how the great Houdini died. And what I think is astounding about this is that Houdini was like the best in the world at surviving big risks. No one else was better at surviving big risks than Houdini. But those risks, like tying himself up in chains, he was prepared for. He knew it was coming. He had a plan for it. It was never a surprise. The one thing that killed him, that he could not survive, was just a skinny college student's punch that he didn't see coming. And what that shows, the takeaway from that's so important for us, is that how risky something is depends on whether you're prepared for it. Not how big you think the risk is, not how much damage you think it can cause, just whether it's a surprise or not. And that's also true in the economy, as we've learned so starkly over the last year and a half with COVID. I mean, one of the things we've learned, I think the biggest lesson from COVID, is that the biggest economic risk is what no one's talking about. Because if no one's talking about it, no one is prepared for it. And if no one's prepared for it, its damage gets amplified when it arrives. I mean, we spent in this industry the better part of the last decade debating what is the biggest economic risk. That's the question that takes up all the oxygen in the industry. And we tend to personify these risks. So people asked in the industry, they said, was this guy the biggest risk to the economy? Was it Barack Obama and the tax hikes of 2013? Was that the biggest risk? Was it this guy here? Was it Ben Bernanke? All the money printing after the financial crisis, was he the biggest risk to our portfolios? Was it this guy? Was it Donald Trump? The trade war, the erratic policies of the last 4 years, was he the biggest risk? Again, this is what took up all the debate in the economics field for a decade. And what's astounding about this is that we know in hindsight, the answer to the question, what's the biggest risk to the economy, is none of these three guys. By far, the biggest risk was this guy here. It was a virus that no one was talking about. It was not in any analyst forecast, any economic outlook until the moment it arrived, and 30 million Americans lost their jobs in 2 months. The biggest risk is what no one was talking about until it happened. But I think if you look historically, that's always the case. I mean, the risks that we talk about that are in the news are things like trade wars and next quarter's profits, budget deficits, elections. And it's not that these things don't pose a risk. It's that they're not surprises. Maybe they're written about in the newspaper every day. Maybe you don't know who's going to win the election, but you know there's going to be an election. It's not a surprise to anyone. If you look historically, what actually moves the needle, what actually makes a difference in the economy, in your portfolio, it's things like COVID-19. And Lehman Brothers couldn't find a buyer in 2008 that started the financial crisis. September the 11th, the terrorist attacks. Pearl Harbor, which dragged America into World War II. Those are the things that actually make a difference and are an order of magnitude more important than all the other little news stories that we read about every day. And the common denominator of these stories here is not that they were big, it's that they were surprises. It's that no one saw them coming until all their damage had occurred. And I think that can be kind of disheartening for people to hear as an investor, that the biggest risk is what you don't see. The biggest risk is what no one's talking about. But I think there's two ways to think about this, to think about risk in a better way as an investor. One is to think about risk as an investor the same way that California thinks about earthquakes, which is having expectations instead of forecasts. What I mean by that is this: if you live in California, you know that earthquakes are going to be a big part of your future, guaranteed. But you can't predict when the next earthquake is going to happen. No one can forecast the next earthquake. There's no earthquake CNBC of 24/7 coverage of people analyzing when the next earthquake might occur, like happens in financial markets. It just doesn't work that way. So rather than forecasting the next earthquake, you just have an expectation that one might occur at any given moment. And they're always prepared for an earthquake to come. I think thinking about risk in financial markets in the same way is the best that we can do. Because look, if I were to say, hypothetically, the next recession will occur in the second half of 2022. Yeah, I'm just making that up. That's a forecast. But if I were to say, historically, there are about, on average, 2 recessions per decade. And I expect that to be the case going forward. I don't know when they're going to occur. I don't know what's going to cause them. But my baseline expectation as an investor, as an asset allocator, as a household, is 2 recessions per decade. That could start at any given moment. That's an expectation. It's very different than a forecast, which is assuming that you know when these things are going to occur and what's going to cause them. The other thing to keep in mind is understanding the difference between getting rich and staying rich. They're 2 completely different skills, and you need to learn how to get them to coexist to do well as an investor over time. Getting rich requires being an optimist, taking a risk, being a long-term investor, being an optimist about people's ability to solve problems and for the economy to grow. That's what you need to get rich. Staying rich requires almost the exact opposite. It requires a degree of pessimism and paranoia, and an observation and acknowledgement that the short term of history is a constant chain of surprises and setbacks and disappointments and recessions and bear markets and pandemics that you need to be able to survive financially in order to stick around long enough for your long-term optimism to actually pay off. That's the third story for you.